They summoned me home, hysterical over my father's supposed heart attack. I hurried back, only to be ambushed with paperwork designed to steal my wealth. I pretended to agree, then dropped a revelation that stunned everyone. Their expressions were priceless. Hello, Reddit community. I was several time zones away, just wrapping up a professional meeting, when my phone started ringing endlessly. First, it was my mom, then my sibling, then my uncle. When I finally picked up, my mother was sobbing so loudly I couldn't make out her words. My sister grabbed the device, tearfully explaining that Dad had suffered a cardiac episode, and I needed to return immediately. My own heart almost stopped. I acted without hesitation. I reserved the very first overnight flight home, my hands shaking throughout the journey. My father and I have often disagreed, but he remains my parent. If something serious had occurred, I couldn't live with the guilt of not being present. I abandoned everything, my job, clients, a massive contract I spent months securing, and flew back to my childhood residence, a place that no longer felt like home. Upon my arrival, there was no emergency vehicle, no hospital news, no physician waiting. Instead, my cousin Mark collected me from the airport, displaying an unusual cheerfulness for someone supposedly distraught over a family emergency. When I inquired about Dad's condition, he paused, then mentioned he was resting at home. The doctor said it wasn't a full attack, just a scare. But yes, he's fine. His eyes, however, did not align with the statement. The way he kept stealing nervous glances made me suspect I was entering a setup. My instincts were screaming, but I attributed it to extreme exhaustion. I reasoned I was being overly suspicious, that my own flesh and blood wouldn't fabricate something this serious. I was completely mistaken. I entered the house anticipating my father to be connected to medical equipment, perhaps pale and frail, maybe relieved to see me. Instead, I found my entire family gathered around the dining table. Mom, Dad, my sister, my uncle, and even their legal counsel. Right in front of them lay a thick bundle of documents. My father looked relatively well. Not great, but certainly not like a man who had just survived a heart attack. He even nodded and remarked, "There he is. Took you long enough." I froze. What in the world was happening? They began speaking rapidly, too quickly, mentioning inheritance, the family enterprise, and how I was the only one whose wealth wasn't tied up in liabilities. They presented it as a desperate plea, claiming the business was failing, that Dad's health incident showed them they needed to organize their affairs, that the transfer of funds on paper was just temporary for tax benefits, and that I could save the family simply by signing a few documents. The lawyer, clearly working for them, smoothly presented the papers as if it were routine practice. But it was far from routine. It was a planned trap. They weren't merely asking for assistance. They were asking me to surrender almost everything I had accumulated over the past decade. My apartment, my investment portfolio, my share of my tech company. All of it was neatly summarized in legal paragraphs, under the pretense of keeping the family business solvent. One quick look was enough. If I signed, I would lose control. My assets would be legally managed by them, and when they inevitably defaulted, I would be left destitute. This wasn't about my father's health. This was about stripping the one family member who had successfully become independent, the one who built a thriving life without sinking with their ship. My relationship with my family had always been complex. Growing up, I was the odd one out, the one who refused to join the family trade, the one who moved away early, pursuing technology over tradition. My success was met with a strange blend of jealousy and contempt. I hadn't married young like my sister. I hadn't conformed to their expectations. I had built my own existence, one that was finally secure and successful. And now, the same people who had scorned me for years were smiling at me as if we were close friends, as if the past were irrelevant, as if we were just one happy unit, and I wasn't being manipulated with emotional pressure. I observed how my mother was no longer weeping, how my father avoided my gaze, how my sister kept interrupting, offering drinks, laughing too loudly, desperate to cover the tension. I looked around the room and grasped that this was not despair. It was calculation. They knew I would show up. They had counted on it. And they had rehearsed this moment like a performance, with each person playing a role. My uncle, the mediator, my mother, the emotional focus. My sister, the pleasant diversion. Even the attorney knew when to nod and assure me it was standard protocol. But none of them were ready for the fact that I have negotiated with investors more ruthless than they were. I have sat opposite chief executives who would sacrifice anything for a profit. This wasn't a family gathering. It was a corporate double-cross disguised as affection. I smiled, picked up the pen, and pretended to sign. The room collectively exhaled. My sister even clapped, saying, "See? That wasn't difficult." I leaned back, paused, surveyed everyone, then calmly slid the documents back toward the lawyer and stated, "Oh, by the way, those signatures are forgeries. You might want to verify them before submitting." The silence was immediate, the kind that makes your ears ring. My mother's face crumbled. My sister flushed bright red. Dad finally looked at me, and the rage in his eyes said it all. Not guilt, not regret, but fury that I hadn't fallen for it. I then stood and moved toward the exit. Before leaving, I turned and spoke the words I'd been holding back since realizing the whole thing was a sham. I flew across the country because I believed my father was dying. You exploited my affection for this family to try and rob me. Never contact me again unless it's a genuine emergency. And next time, hire better actors. This whole scene was pitiful. As I reached the front door, my uncle called out, "Wait, we can clarify." I didn't even glance back. I walked out and shut the door forcefully behind me. But I didn't head back to my hotel. I went straight to the bank. If they were this desperate, there was clearly more going on than I realized. And the people I once trusted with my childhood might be planning an even worse move. I'm not just going to let this go this time. I'm going to uncover the full extent of this betrayal. And if my suspicions about those documents are correct, then this is no longer just about money. It's about a confrontation. The next morning, I was still running on sheer willpower and minimal sleep. I couldn't shake the expression on my father's face when I revealed the fake signature. It wasn't the look of a man caught in a mistake. It was the look of someone who had been meticulously planning that moment for weeks, possibly months. The staged cardiac incident, the manufactured urgency, the pile of paperwork, all carefully phrased to shift financial responsibility. I suddenly wondered how many times they had rehearsed it before my arrival. How long had they been counting on my compliance? I needed definitive answers. So I skipped breakfast, ignored the barrage of calls and messages they were already sending, and went straight to the one person I knew had a reason to talk, my cousin Mark. Mark wasn't the brains of the operation. He was a follower, easily led into whatever scheme the rest of the family devised. But he wasn't spiteful, just spineless. I found him outside a small cafe on the outskirts of town, waiting for his breakfast order, as if it were a totally normal day. When he saw me approaching, his face lost all color. He didn't flee or lie, not because he was brave, but because he was too clueless to understand how deep his involvement actually was. I didn't even ask any questions. I just stared at him for a full minute, my arms crossed, while he nervously fumbled with his coffee and tried to pretend I wasn't there. Eventually, he broke. He confessed everything. The family business had been hemorrhaging funds for years. My dad had made a series of terrible investments, some questionable, some outright illegal, a disastrous property deal, a phantom corporation in Nevada that disappeared overnight, a silent partner who had been stealing money without anyone noticing until it was too late. They had mortgaged almost every single asset. The main house, the holiday property, the land Dad had inherited. Everything was leveraged to its absolute limit. And then there was the lawsuit, which I had known nothing about. A former employee had filed a claim alleging tax fraud and manipulated profits. The company was under investigation, and a massive court ruling was anticipated. If they lost, the family would be bankrupt, and criminal charges would be possible. That's why they needed my assets, not for the company, but for themselves, to evade prison and prevent the authorities from seizing the small amount they had left. I walked away from that cafe feeling sick. I stood on the pavement staring blankly for a solid 5 minutes. Everything I had grown up believing, my parents, my sister, the business, the home I once thought I'd inherit, was all a lie now. Just a facade held together by deceit and the assumption that family ties meant you had to sacrifice everything, even your own well-being, for them. But they stopped being my family the instant they used my love for them as a weapon. When they turned me into a cash machine with a pulse, that's when I knew what needed to be done. I had to expose them completely. I immediately contacted a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but one I collaborated with for years in my firm. Trustworthy, sharp, and cutthroat when necessary. I detailed the entire situation. The documents they tried to make me sign, the possible fraud, the invented health crisis. She listened calmly. Then she told me something that changed everything. If they attempted to forge my name or submitted even one copy of those papers as legally binding, it could constitute fraud. And if they used those documents in any financial dealing, it would open them up to investigation, potentially even criminal prosecution. She requested copies, and I provided them. She told me she would take the lead, and that I needed to remain silent, observe, and wait. And so I did. 2 weeks later, the same lawyer called. Her voice was quiet, her message simple. They tried to use the papers. They submitted them to a private lending institution, claiming they had my full backing. The lender grew suspicious and initiated a verification process. They found the difference in signatures. They found the pattern of inconsistencies. They found enough to halt the transaction and report it to the authorities. My family's desperate scheme had finally pushed them too far. And this time, it was all recorded, provable, and real. I didn't celebrate or gloat, but I did show up at their house one final time. Not to yell or argue, but just to say what needed to be said. They opened the door as if they were seeing a phantom. I informed them that I knew everything, that the lawsuit, the debts, the fraud, the lies, all of it was exposed, that the investigation had already started. I told them the only reason I hadn't pressed formal charges myself was because I wanted to depart cleanly, seeking peace, not vengeance. I informed them I was permanently severing all legal and financial connections, updating my will and security measures, and freezing any account that had even the slightest association with the family, and that if they ever reached out to me again, I would reveal everything publicly. My mother wept. My sister pleaded. My father said nothing. He just stared at me as if I had destroyed something sacred. Perhaps I had, but I hadn't destroyed love. I had destroyed their final illusion of control. That day, I stopped being their source of wealth. I became the consequence they believed would never arrive. I left and never looked back. Since then, my life has been calmer, not effortless. Letting go of your family, regardless of how toxic, is like losing a part of yourself you relied on. It hurts, especially during holidays. But you know what doesn't hurt? My bank account, my peace of mind, my mornings free of anxiety. I still receive occasional updates, gossip from old neighbors or distant relatives. The business went bankrupt. The lawsuit is ongoing. My sister moved in with a friend. My parents sold their house. None of it is surprising. They constructed their reality on lies and expected me to sustain it indefinitely. But I am finished supporting burdens that were never mine to bear. Ultimately, family is not defined by blood. It is defined by respect, by personal space, by love that comes without obligations. Once you realize that, you stop pursuing ghosts and houses that were never truly homes.